So I'll tell you, we're with an uphill battle here because I am going to argue that this parable has nothing to do with heaven or hell. Which seems like a hard argument to make because you've got agony and flames, you've got comforting, blah, blah, blah. Well, one of the interesting parts is that Jesus uses the word Hades here. Does anybody know about Hades in Greek mythology? Is it a place of torment?
Wasn't that the Lord of Ragnarok?
Right, so Hades was a god, but Hades was also a place where that god ruled. And it's the place where all dead people go. It is not a place of torment. It is also not a place of justification or, reward. It's just where dead people go.
I'm curious, doing the Roman Catholic thing, does this have anything to do with limbo or purgatory?
So limbo and purgatory were inventions in the medieval period to basically create a way for the living to justify the dead after they died, and like how to deal with the fact that judgment doesn't happen right away. So that's a whole complicated theological question, but in essence, no, it doesn't have anything to do with that. Limbo and purgatory kind of like functionally operate that way, except that in Greek mythology, there is no judgment afterwards, right? And the same in Jewish mythology. In the Jewish understanding of the cosmos, it's a three-tiered universe. There's the tier above, which is the heavens, where God and the angels and so forth are. There's the tier in the middle, where living things are, and then there's the tier below, which is called Sheol, which is where all the dead things are. And there's no judgment in that place. It's just where everybody goes. And so it's interesting that he uses the word Hades. In fact, the concept of hell is not actually easy to find in the New Testament. There are translations that put the word hell in the New Testament, but the actual word is often Gehenna, which is the name of a giant burning trash heap outside of the city of Jerusalem that never goes out. It's just constantly burning because, more trash, burning, etc., right? So hell is an invention that was added. What's interesting, though, is that the concept of hell was being formulated around the time that Jesus lived to make sense of martyrdom. Really, more than anything else, it was how do we explain God's goodness and God's justice in the midst of an unjust world? So similar to the things we were talking about last week about capitalism, are part of the reason that the concepts of heaven and hell were created within Jewish theology. Because you can't have good people getting murdered all the time by empire and not explain that somehow within the context of a good God. So in so many ways, the creation of the concept of heaven and hell historically within the Judeo-Christian tradition was really about justifying God in the face of wickedness on earth. And yet, it still becomes a very useful tool for submission and subordination and control by empire when empire runs the show. And so we get this whole thing kind of twisted. Now, I am grateful that I came up in a Christian in name only household. And I was not indoctrinated into the terror of hell. In fact, I used to be one of those kids, I was one of those kids that had a t-shirt that had a picture of the little red-faced guy with the horns and the little mustache, and it said, "God's busy, can I help you?" And I would wear it very proudly all the time, right? And it was very... on the Church of Satan, I don't know how many of you have seen the Church of Satan in the news bunch. Well, the Church of Satan is actually a non-theistic, atheistic group of people that are really organizing to challenge the rise of the religious right. They really exist in order to disrupt the theological narrative about heaven and hell. Their whole purpose is to introduce rationalism. And so they're creating Satan clubs in these schools, mostly to piss off people that aren't really paying attention to what they're doing. But underneath that is actually to kind of disrupt some of the they would use lots of colorful words. I would say disrupt the schema that's being created by the religious right that's so emphatic about this heaven and hell doctrine. I'll tell you that I don't think this parable has anything to do with heaven and hell for a variety of reasons. And we can pick it apart in coffee hour if you want. I can talk more about specifically what's going on in the passage that I don't think has that. But I won't spend my time on that because there is something really important that I think this passage is about. It's about revelation, the revealing, the unearthing. The word apocalypse means to pull back the veil. And I think that this story is an apocalyptic story because it's revealing something important about what happens when people have privilege. And I know that I'm this woke white dude who's trying to talk to you about this all the time, and I'm sure some of you are tired of it, but just hear me out for a second. There's a chasm that exists before either of these guys die. There's a separation between the world of Lazarus and the world of the rich man that is profound. I don't think either of them could understand each other's lives if they wanted to. But I bet you Lazarus has a much better understanding of the rich man's life than the rich man has of Lazarus' life. The rich man knows who Lazarus is. He calls him by name. And he assumes that he should operate in the world as a servant. He's talking to Abraham and telling Abraham to command this guy to do all of this stuff for him. I think that this whole story is about the blindness that comes from occupying a position of privilege in the world. Now, when I talk about privilege, I have a very simple definition that's actually relatively complex. My definition is your privilege is all the things you don't have to pay attention to. So if you walk rather easily, you probably don't notice all the time when there's a curb that doesn't have a ramp on it. But if you're in a wheelchair, you know which corners to avoid here in North Admiral because you have to work really hard to get up onto that curb. Right? Privilege is just the things you don't have to pay attention to because you don't have to pay attention to them. And we all have all different kinds of privilege. I know in the last 10 years, the concept of white privilege has come front and center, and every time anybody talks about privilege, usually that's what they're talking about. And usually it becomes this place to beat your chest and be so, repentant, and oh my God, I'm so terrible because I have all this privilege. But that's not the point. And we miss the point, and I think we do injustice to the concept when we think that somehow we have to be repentant about our privilege. Or we talk about economic privilege, right? And we see people in poverty, and we feel this kind of like, oh God, am I a bad person because this person is in poverty? And we make it so personal to ourselves. But I want to tell you that privilege is ubiquitous because all of us are particular. And all of us have a particular way of moving through the world, and all of us have things we really have to pay attention to in order to survive and thrive. And we all have places where the environment is set up to make it easy for us to move through the world. And we don't notice, but other people who aren't familiar and aren't comfortable and aren't embodied the same way go into that environment, and there's all kinds of barriers for them. And we just don't know. Because those aren't barriers for us. Can you guys think, just point them out, what are some examples of places where you don't experience a barrier, but there are people you love who do experience a barrier around a particular thing? Just give me a couple of quick examples.
You can walk into any store and be treated with respect.
You can walk into any store and be treated with respect.
Transportation.
Transportation. Give me more specifics.
My sister Marilyn can't get anywhere unless she has a special bus provided by the city. I can get in my car, I can get on a bus, I can get on a water taxi, I can walk.
Perfect
Tons of
example.
stuff.
Yeah, what else?
Police, when I get stopped for anything like a broken light, I just go get it fixed, sister.
Right.
I don't get arrested for anything except probably murder.
And the assumption is that those are people that are there to help you.
Absolutely.
And you can
I'm
lean
not
into that
afraid.
assumption.
I'm not afraid of them. I go to policemen for help.
Exactly. What are some other examples?
Language.
Language, say more.
Anybody who doesn't speak fluent English is SOL.
Yeah, if you don't speak English, you're in trouble, but even if you are an English language learner, the ways that people interact with you and talk to you, have you ever been in the presence of someone trying to talk to somebody who has a strong accent and the way that they treat them is so different than the way that they treat you? Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you. Let me get two more. What are two more examples of a place where you can move easily through the world, but somebody else has a challenge?
Severe mental illness.
Severe mental illness. Say a little bit more.
They're making their way through the world and it's totally not understandable to people who are presupposed to not have severe mental illness. Their way of living, behaving, acting out.
And the resources that they have to find to get support often assume that you have a certain level of competency in order to get those resources.
And if they were just fucked up, they'd be
Right. Right. Go ahead.
Those who
Ken.
are deaf and cannot communicate, only using sign language, right? Being able to say things or do
Absolutely, like the non-hearing community, or even people that have limited hearing, right? Some places are set up for that, right? A lot of churches have these like extra little systems that you can put on that advance your hearing aids or hearing aids that can be tuned into the audio of the church, and then some places don't. And then there's a lot of the world that doesn't even think about that. It's like, well, if you can, you can, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Or just technology, you're not having the money to afford technology or not knowing how to use it. Like everything is email and text, and it's for people that don't have that access. It's almost like you're not part of the modern world anymore.
Absolutely. And not just people that don't have access to those things financially, but also there's a whole different like schema about interacting with the world mediated digitally versus mediated physically. And a lot of people haven't been kind of welcomed into that way of thinking about the world. And if there's huge barriers, right? Where do you go? I mean, how many of you have had to go ask for help to use your computer or use your email, right? And how easy was it for you because it was provided by your employer versus it's out there in the world?
Well, that technology part also limits the jobs that people can get because most jobs now require that you have some computer skills.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's become foundational, right? It's an assumption. Go ahead.
Big area of privilege for me is that I can physically be affectionate with my sweetie in virtually any situation where people can be affectionate and not risk danger, harm.
Yeah. And that's where some of these issues of privilege get really complicated, is like some of it's how the physical world is set up, right? The systemic structures that exist, like ramps, right? Like technology accessibility. And then some of it is this privilege that's completely social. And it has to do with whether I'm at threat of violence or not, right? Whether just being myself in the world makes me a target of violence or not. And that is one of those examples how privilege is completely contextual. Because we can make spaces that are designed to be safer for people, and then there are spaces that are designed to be less safe for certain people. And so this is this kind of weird takeaway, and one of the things that I really want you all to think about as you go out into the world and encounter people talking about privilege all the time, and trying to say, God, can we just get past the conversation of privilege? Is that it is inherent to being an embodied person. And we're always going to have to deal with it. So I want to ask you this question, why? Why should you deal with your privilege? And by that, what I mean is, why should you start looking at the world and noticing the places where you don't have to pay attention? Doesn't it just make your life harder?
What I think for me is the point that if I understand this type of privilege, which I have, I can be more welcoming or useful to people who don't have that thing. To be more sensitive to their issues, like ramps.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're not aware of that, you miss the opportunity to help people.
Mm-hmm. So does that mean that I have to want to help people all the time?
Well, not all the time, but when you see someone struggling, if you don't understand ramps or, lots of other things, you don't even know how to.
Sure.
So, and that makes me anyway go the other direction.
Sure.
If I can't figure something out, I would just assume.
Sure. Go ahead.
For me, similar to what Susie is saying, first I think of giving gratitude for what I do have and accomplish and so forth. And second, to pray for those who don't.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not at all powerful to do anything, maybe my time or donation of money. But what I can do is pray.
Mm-hmm. So you'd say that working on your privilege actually helps orient you towards God.
Makes me aware.
Because it gives you that gratitude, but also helps you see the difficulty, the suffering, the challenge of other people as part of yours, because you all are part of God. Go ahead.
I'm actually thankful that there was a time in my life where my finances were, complete wreck, and I lived poor. And I remember, I'm a gardener, I remember for an entire year not being able to have a plant, to buy a plant. And finally, after 2 years, I was able to buy a geranium for $1.49 a dozen. This was decades ago. And it really helped me understand what a lot of people go through on a day-to-day basis. And I always try to remember that.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the grant world, I worked as a city planner in the community, and so I was able to actually do a better job as a floodplain manager for the federal government and the grant manager for the federal government, because I could relate to what the local government officials had to deal with in applying for and implementing their grant programs. And they recognized that and they appreciated it.
Right. It allowed you to have some kind of, not just compassion, but like understanding for the worldview and the space that people are in. So I want to ask the converse question, which is, how does it benefit you to start acknowledging the places where you don't have privilege? How does it benefit you to start seeing the places where you are uniquely or particularly limited? And how do you keep yourself from just identifying with it as a victim of circumstance? Because all of us have places where we're lacking in our privilege. And some people would say that when all these conversations about privilege, what they do is they encourage people to identify as victims forever. How would you speak back to that?
You just reminded me, I follow a bunch of people, and one of my gurus is I call her them. The lady says, if somebody's driving a car that you want and you can't afford, don't be angry with them, appreciate it because it exists. Mm-hmm. And if they have it, then it's possible for you to have it too. Mm-hmm. Appreciate it because it exists.
Interesting. I like that. Don't be jealous of something, be appreciative that it even exists in the world as a possibility. Go ahead.
I have some mobility issues. Everybody knows that. So I think, in a way, it gives you an opportunity to have an appreciation for those who help you, and for those who don't see it as a reason to stay away or make it difficult for you. And it makes it so you are aware of the things that you might have trouble doing, but you feel like a challenge is right in front of you every time you try to do something new. Like we went on a train trip. I'd never been on a train trip before. I didn't know if I was going to fall on the way out of the train or whatever. And you have some worries, you have some concerns about things related to what you can't do. But you also find out that you can meet challenges that are set before you that you didn't think you could meet.
Mm-hmm. So it actually, in some ways, allows you to feel kind of called in by those limitations rather than called out or made less than. Right. Interesting. ahead.
Well, it's my situation in the last 6 months. I've dealt with everybody, from the lowest peon to the highest. The part about it is, what's gonna happen to all these other people? What happens to all these other people that don't know how to jump for those women? Who don't know how to push, who don't know anything to get through their life more easily. I'm not saying it was easy, because it wasn't. But there's got to be a way that the person calling in can get what they need without a 6-month delay.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, part of what Kathy just said made me think it's like the song we just sang. When you have limitations, quite often talking to other people want to help one another. You know, my mom used to say, you don't know if you don't ask. So sometimes just bringing something up and bringing a problem to someone else, because that's what the song says too, if you don't tell me, how do I know your needs?
Right.
That it's a way in which people are able to help one another, so the person with limits and the person who's gone through it or doesn't have limits can help each other.
Thank you, Mother.
Yeah. She also said sometimes let the world turn once, don't deal with that problem yet.
I like that. Bridget, go ahead.
I'm just conscious of the great difference in terms of bodily safety and autonomy. And that, you know, that we now actually can talk about the fact that this United States is the most dangerous country for women. You know, for physical violence, sexual abuse, whether it's in the workplace, random, at home, and the courage that it takes to change this power differential to say, you know, you're not entitled to do whatever you want to a woman's body, or to tell her what she can do or can't do. And that's massive, you know, to really, to understand how you lack that, I wouldn't even say it privilege, just that fundamental human right, then really raises your awareness of what other people without privilege experience. And so you have that deepened awareness and sensitivity to others, and hopefully it kindles the passion for justice and opportunities then for solidarity, as we've just been talking about, to stand together and say, if we care about justice, then we have to care about this, and it's not right. And at whose expense do some people have this privilege? And to really start to, you know, unpack that, dismantle it, look at it, and say, is it really okay with me that I have privilege in all these other ways, and I'm just fine with that, but, you know, I don't want to, you know, I really want to shake up where I don't have privilege, but I'm indifferent to others. So I think it's that fundamental question of if we stand for justice, what does it look like in our everyday life? To fight for our own and others.
Right. I mean, one thing I'm really hearing out of this is if we're going to recognize and acknowledge these systems and structures, and then these social creations that create suffering in the world, we have to be ready and willing to talk about how they're creating suffering for us. And we have to be ready and willing to share that, to be vulnerable about the fact that, like, yeah, y'all are getting along fine in this, but like my lack of X is really making it hard for me to be here. And kind of trusting that the Spirit of God is going to be present to hold that the Spirit of God desires your flourishing. Because so often in our history, it has been, well, that's your problem, right? Not our problem. And when you bring that up, you bring us all down. When instead, I think that we're growing in this understanding that, like, when you bring that up, it helps all of us bring all of us up. Because how many other people are in the room silently suffering with this thing and not feeling like it's safe for them to talk about it? Right? Just look at the Me Too movement over the last few years and the ways that when one person speaks up and they get lambasted, and the next person speaks up and they get lambasted, now there's 50 people standing up, and you can't do that to them anymore. And God willing, perhaps our culture has shifted and moved. The difficulty here is that we have to not personalize these things. We have to not personalize our privilege or our lack of privilege. Because privilege in and of itself, by definition, is contextual. Wherever you go, you are you entering different spaces, and those different spaces are either designed to support your fullness of presence, or they're designed to support somebody else's fullness of presence, and there's parts of you that aren't going to work there. Or there's parts of you that are going to work there great, that aren't going to work for other people. It's just inherent. We need to stop the moralism about this. When we go back to the parable and look at it, what's the real problem? The real problem is that the rich man still thinks that Lazarus should be his servant. Even when Abraham, who is cuddling this guy, refers to the rich man as child, makes it very clear that this is a family affair, right? But he doesn't get it. He continues to not get it. In fact, the only family he cares about are the people that are socialized into the same privileged class of people as he is. And he wants them to avoid this fate, but he doesn't even know why he's there. He's like, go back and tell them. But it's like, tell them what? Tell them the message of Moses and the prophets, that we're all one people and that our shared collective responsibility is to care for each other? Do you think they don't know that already? Well, maybe they don't. Part of our privilege is our inability sometimes to see other people as fully beloved of God and worthy, just as we are. But we don't know that we think that, because we don't know the places where we think you should just buck up, right? That's to Wes's point about mental illness. Sometimes we don't know where we think, like, oh, that's on you, man. You need to figure that shit out. Right? We don't know that until we start encountering each other. See, in my mind, the real issue is that privilege limits the ability for us to have authentic relationship. That's really what it does. Because we can't really connect with someone because some parts of them are going to run into conflict with things that are easy for us. And some parts of us are going to run into conflict. And how many times have you stopped having a conversation with somebody because there was no way they were going to get the thing you were trying to share with them? How many times have you been like, I am going to explain this to you because there is no way you're going to meet me here. You don't know how hard this is, and you're not really trying. And all your platitudes and all your explanations and all your nonsense is just going to give me heartburn. So I'm just not going to talk about it. And you're like, oh, look, this relationship goes this far and no further, right? And you don't cut them out. You just kind of put them in that bucket of like kind of a friend. And then when shit goes down, you're not looking in that bucket for support unless everything else is going terrible and you're like, well, I'll take what I can get, right? But I'll trust you like this much, right? Because like I can't talk to you about incontinence because you can't handle that conversation, right? Guys, I shouldn't say this. I should say that differently. I was going to say, we are Christian people, and I don't want to put that on you. This is a community that is defined by following Christ. I identify as a Christian. I don't know about you, and I'm not trying to tell you that's the right thing to do, but I am trying to tell you that the center of following Christ is being deviant as hell. Because we are trying to deviate from the norm. And the norm is an honor-shame system that says some people are righteous and good and deserve to go to heaven, and a bunch of other people are horrible pieces of garbage and they deserve exactly what they get. And some people deserve to have the doors open for them and to walk in and make it easy, and other people really make it hard for themselves. And it's their own fault. And if they just shut up and stop talking about their difficulties and their limitations and their sexuality and all their shit, then their life would be fine just like ours. Right? We are called to be deviant people because we are called to follow Christ. And the most deviant thing you can possibly do is to start acknowledging and undermining the normalness of your privilege and of everyone's privilege. It's essentially inherently disruptive to start talking about and naming privilege, because privilege is about normalizing a way of being in the world, about not having to notice the dangers for other people. It is absolutely fundamentally essential that we as Christian people are doing this deviant work. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated. This is Mark chapter 9. This is a conversation that's happening about who do we include, who's doing the same work as we're doing, and what is the work. So this is from Mark chapter 9, and I'll just read verses 38 to 41. This is Jesus' advice. John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a deed of power in my name will be able soon afterward to speak ill of me. Whoever is not against us is for us." And this is the punchline. "For truly I tell you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you bear the name of Christ will by no means lose their reward." It's as small as that. Where are we given a cup of water? Where are we given a helping hand? Where are we given some understanding? We don't have to save the world. We're not called to save the world. We are called to serve in the world. And the best way we can do that is just by acknowledging the realities, the systems and structures and social realities that are making it hard for people to be their full, authentic self. We are called to see everyone as God sees everyone, as beloved children, and we as equal siblings, close to the heart of God.